Herzlich willkommen alle. Wir hatten ja am ersten Abend diese große Herausforderung mit dem Fußballspiel. Heute ist die Herausforderung mehr Richtung Natur gegangen und wir haben den Regen draußen. Ich habe jedenfalls verschiedene Messages schon gekriegt, dass jedenfalls in verschiedenen Teilen Berlins offenbar es gerade noch so stark ist, dass man das Haus gar nicht verlassen kann. Jedenfalls freue ich mich sehr, dass Sie alle, die den Weg hierhin gefunden haben, dass Sie ihn gefunden haben, dass Sie hier sind. Heute Abend ist ja gewissermaßen der große Showdown, Episode 3 von Kapitalismus gegen Sozialismus. Und alle können jetzt mal wetten, wer gewinnen wird. Es ist wirklich überwältigend, dass wir hier Abend für Abend so viel und ein so interessiertes Publikum haben. Und ich glaube, alle, die in den letzten Abenden da waren, werden mir zustimmen, dass es immer wieder ein wirklich grandioses Vergnügen ist, Lea Ypi zuzuhören, in ihrem Versuch hier ein großes Panorama des moralischen Sozialismus in 3 Teilen zu entwerfen. Wie Sie gemerkt haben, steigt also die Spannung von Frage zu Frage und von Tag zu Tag, von Lecture zu Lecture. Gestern standen im Mittelpunkt des Vortrags die Strukturen, die Rollen festlegen und die in mancher Hinsicht die Appelle an das individuelle Handeln ins Leere laufen lassen. Das ist ja etwas, was man, wenn man auf den ersten Blick hört, hier geht es um moralischen Sozialismus und Lea Ypi verbindet Marx mit Kant, könnte man ja denken, wie passt das denn? Im einen Fall geht es um Individuen und Autonomie, im anderen Fall ist es eine Analyse von Strukturen. Und wie wir gesehen haben, ist es ganz und gar nicht so, dass Lea Ypi das aus dem Blick verlieren würde, sondern ganz im Gegensatz steht das im Zentrum dieser Analyse dessen, was unsere Handlungsfähigkeit behindert. Wer letztes Jahr schon hier war bei Sally Hesslinger, erinnert sich sicher daran, dass Sally Hesslinger den Vorschlag gemacht hat, man solle solche Strukturen anhand von ganz konkreten Problemen unterlaufen und neue Beziehungsformen entwickeln. Diejenigen unter Ihnen, die sogar im Jahr davor bei Nancy Fraser hier waren, denen ist bestimmt in Erinnerung, dass Nancy vor allem Arbeitskämpfe als Hebel für solche strukturellen Veränderungen empfohlen hat. Und auch Lea hat gestern von Strukturen und Klassen gesprochen. Vor allem aber hat sie uns für heute eine Lösung versprochen oder jedenfalls einen Hinweis darauf, worauf wir hoffen können und worauf wir hoffen müssen, wenn wir gemeinsam die Strukturen verändern wollen, die unsere Handlungsfähigkeit einschränken. Lea, ich bin sehr, sehr, sehr gespannt auf diesen letzten Vortrag, den letzten Abend und freue mich wie immer wahnsinnig, dass du da bist.
Thank you very much, everyone, for being back again. So tonight's question is, what may I hope? To which a lot of people might be tempted to answer, actually, nothing. But that wouldn't work because the question is a trick question. It presupposes that you may hope something. And so it's not asking you, actually, is there hope or not? It assumes that there is hope, and it's asking you, well, what is the object of this hope? And that seems right, because I don't know how many of you have read this fantastic Russian novel called Oblomov, the first 50 pages of which are about a character that can't be bothered to get out of bed in the morning because he can't actually hope for anything. And to get out of bed means that you can hope for something. And then at some point, the plot of the novel moves on after these first 50 pages in which it's all about him being in bed and not being able to get out of it. And so he moves from the bed to the chair. And then when he's described out of his bed, but on this chair, the author, Goncharov, writes, and I quote from this novel, "Now or never, to be or not to be." Oblomov raised himself from his chair a little, but failing to find his slippers with his feet at once, sat down again. So that is a character that really has no hope. And you all have actually fought your inner Oblomovs today, because you did get out of bed this morning, and you did find your shoes to come here, and you came here, and here you are. And presumably you were hoping for something. And I personally also just came out of a debate in which I went with a lot of hope and came out with a little bit less, but still some. So most people actually tend to think about hope as something, an attitude that sits somewhere between a desire and a belief. So the desire for a certain outcome and the belief that something will favor the realization of this outcome. So what we do is we kind of look for evidence in the world to see if the world conforms to our wishes, and if we find it, we have hope. If we don't find it, we don't have hope. And I want to suggest today that actually hope is something different, and that being hopeful has nothing to do with how the world goes. And so in this sense, I agree with the words of the Czech dissident Václav Havel, who said hope is a state of the mind, not a state of the world. Hope is not the same as the reassurance that we get when things are going well, but as Havel said, the ability to work for something because it's the right thing to do, not because it has a chance to succeed. Or, to put it in now his quote, hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. So when the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci spoke of the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will, I think he was also getting close to something like that attitude, speaking about the kind of hope that we get from the necessity to act in a certain way. So I would say that hope is a necessary complement to morality, and it's that necessary complement because in many ways it's the opposite of the Oblomov nihilistic attitude. And actually, paradoxically, the worse the world goes, the more hope you have to have. Because you must be able to continue to fight for a better world that you prefer to the one that you live in. And so being hopeful is actually not at all about guaranteeing that things will go your way or that you will get to the outcome, but about preserving the right principle. And the principle for Havel and for me and for Kant is a principle based on which a moral world makes sense. So, from this point of view, a moral world makes sense only if you do something about it, only if you work towards it. But of course, you can't work on it alone. And so your faith in this world that makes sense, you can sustain it with your own personal efforts, but they are also part of a chain of other people's efforts, which is both has to be coordinated and it has to be continued in time. So basically, there are 2 points of view from which you can ask yourself, what can you hope? There is an individual one, and then there's a collective one. From the point of view of the individual, the answer is actually very easy, and the statements about hope that I was just giving you from Havel and from Gramsci answer it. You don't ask yourself whether you should be hopeful or not as an individual, but what you can do to encourage action that makes sense. So the answer to the practical faith, to the necessity of being hopeful from your own personal individual perspective, is actually given by the necessity to just act in a direction that realizes the way in which you want this world that you live in to make sense. And so in that sense, as we said yesterday, this question of what should I do becomes the question of what should we do, and that question is necessary and sustains that attitude of hope. But now I'm going to explore a different, more difficult version of the question around hope, which turns from an individual form to something a little bit more complicated. Because we say, yes, okay, we're saying we have hope, the individual can gain hope from his action with others, but that just makes the question of personal hope then turn into the question of collective hope. So what actually guarantees that all our moral and political efforts can succeed at this collective level? So what's the point of actually all of us trying to do the right thing if we have no reason to think that anything will happen or that something will be successful? So what's the point of holding other people responsible, of blaming or continuing this action together if we think that responsibility is beyond their capacity, and so whatever we all do will be lost at some point, it will be destroyed? What if moral socialism can't succeed? Because, not because it's not the right thing to aspire to, but because the kinds of politics that it requires is just too difficult to believe in and too demanding. And so essentially it's asking you to construct a world in which human beings can transcend borders of nation and religion and culture and even class at some point, and be motivated to act in the name of humanity. So what evidence is there that morality can motivate at this collective level? And I think this is the point at which the question of personal hope turns into the question of collective progress. And that's how it also becomes, in Kantian terms, a question of history and thinking about what are the conditions under which we can even think about progress in history. So let me start with two kind of clarifications. The first one, what does it mean to believe in progress? Can we believe in progress? We have to have, for the individual to have hope, it must make sense for the collective to be able to work together. For the collective to be able to work together, it has to believe in progress, that collectives can actually do something together. So what is this postulate of progress? What does it mean to believe in progress? And I will place this postulate in its kind of epistemic status in between two propositional attitudes that are two extreme kinds of belief. So the first one is the belief that progress is not impossible. And that's kind of plausible, but it's also completely trivial, because the position that progress is not impossible becomes strong just because the alternative is weak. And the alternative is weak because the alternative says, actually, progress is impossible. And to say that progress is impossible means to make a kind of guess about the future, which you're not entitled to make, because none of us can actually know that progress is impossible. So it must be possible as well. And so it kind of commits us, this second attitude that progress is impossible, commits us to what Kant called a form of prophetic theorizing about the future, where you think you can foresee in advance what happens without actually being able to give any evidence of what will happen. So that's the first proposition. Progress is not impossible, and that seems too weak. There's a second one that's the other extreme, which is that progress is necessary. And that's too strong, because in arguing the case, we are misunderstanding the nature of the agents that are responsible for directing actions compatibly with their imperatives. And again, because this would be a type of prophetic history where we put ourselves and we turn into prophets of the future, and it would that position can only be warranted if the human being can completely shape the future from this moral perspective. The problem, however, is that morality is not all there is to the human. And so if we could only count on moral dispositions, yet we could say that progress is necessary. But since we don't just rely on moral dispositions, there's a lot of other complex things. Our reasons for action are more mixed. They're not always inspired by moral principles. It's very difficult to know what to expect from these circumstances. So if you live, for example, in a world of alienation, it's really hard to say that the kinds of politics that enable us to overcome this alienation is necessary because of the types of constraints on the human at that point. So to believe that progress, to believe in progress is to say a little bit more that progress is not impossible and a little bit less than progress is necessary. So what kind of notion of progress can we have that supports this intermediate statement? And what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to scrutinize and to defend an old-fashioned idea, which is that to answer whether the belief in progress of this kind is warranted, we need to shift our perspective. And we need to shift our perspective from the agents, from the individual agents, to even the individual agents that are acting collectively at one particular point in time, to history as seen from a particular standpoint that I'm going to spell out, which is philosophical history. So we need to explore history from a philosophical perspective that enables us to look at events from a normatively purposeful standpoint, which integrates assumptions that we make about moral actions and observations that we make about moral actions as they filter through these historical events. But before we do that, I want to start to consider one criticism that will probably spring to everyone's mind right away, which is, should we even talk about progress? Isn't progress actually both maybe necessary, but also a completely dangerous idea? And it's necessary because it's, as I said, embedded in our thinking about morality in a certain way. but also because in the pursuit of progress, as we know, has given rise to dangerous narratives of civilizational superiority or paternalism or colonial domination. And hopefully it goes without saying that that's not the kind of progress that I want to defend here. And so I want to defend a more critical account of progress and try and articulate what that critical account of progress might look like. So I want to suggest that we actually think about progress, not in terms of reaching a goal that we prescribe to ourselves and we must impose to other people no matter what to do the same progress, but when the institutions that we construct reflect from what we learn from the failures and the successes of the past, or the trials and the failures of the past. So it's a kind of notion of progress as learning processes. And at the heart of this notion of progress is a conception, a critical conception of history, not just as the sum of events and characters in history, but history seen from a philosophical perspective. And so history reconstructed from a moral standpoint. And I'm going to do that by going into a little bit more detail into the analysis that Kant offers when he explores the notion of progress with regard to the French Revolution, and the French Revolution as an event that he thinks is a sign that progress is possible in history, and the sign of our tendency to make progress towards the better. You can have very controversial views about the French Revolution. Nothing I'll say hangs on to actually that assessment of the French Revolution. I'll explain the reasoning, and then I think it's a more complicated analysis than which events we single out as being progressive from this moral standpoint. But before I do that, I also want to say something more about the notion of progress that is at the heart of the alternative analysis to the moral socialist one. And so I'm going to go back to the orthodox Marxist account and to that notion of progress in that tradition, in that historical materialist tradition. And because at the heart of that tradition, there is also something like progress as learning process. And it's, however, one that takes a slightly different form from the one that I'm going to describe. And so I'm going to start by saying what I think are the problems of that account, and then move on to why I think this alternative is somehow better. So central to the historical materialists' analysis is the idea that if we speak about progress at all, we have to develop a method for explaining why crises in social and political institutions occur. So what are the problems? If we think about progress as a process of learning from the trials and failures, we have to develop a method of thinking what are the problems here. And the unit of concern we already explained in that account as well is the world. And we have to do this is the assumption of that theory at the most general possible level, by explaining social change in a way that can't be reduced to culturally specific or religious specific institutions, but that tells us a more comprehensive and also more detailed story about features that we all share beyond this account of being in these different religious or cultural groups. And socialist theory here is promising because it focuses on an analysis of capitalism as an economic phenomenon in many ways, which develops out of these transactions between individuals that are not reducible to cultural distinctions or religious distinctions, indeed emerges from the attempt to overcome them. But it's also to do with more material factors, with what Marx would have called the forces of production. And so the forces of production encompass the means of production, so physical capital, natural resources, technology, labor power, so human labor, skills, expertise. It encompasses organizational structures like management, entrepreneurship, corporate financial systems, and so on. It encompasses production processes, so manufacturing, logistics, supply chains, and then information and communication. And none of these, capacity that this theory has to take into account of all of this, none of it is reducible to these linguistic or cultural differences or religious differences. Now, in that traditional historical materialist account of progress, social revolutions and historical progress are explained in terms of the contrast between what is called the forces of production and the relations of production. So, as the old story goes, that a lot of people will know, the development of different productive forces leads to different relations of production, which in turn give rise to different social and political institutions. And as productive forces evolve, they come into conflict with these relations of production, which create tension between the different social classes, which are positioned on opposing sides of this conflict. And within this framework, capitalism, for example, is a specific stage in the historical development of this tension between the forces of production and the relations of production, which, as you can see, is a very general story about how humans relate to each other. It can't be really reduced to anything cultural specific, and is characterized by particular productive forces and relations of production that shape the distinctive character that capitalist institutions take at a particular point in time. Now, in the more up-to-date analytical Marxist interpretations of historical materialism, as someone like G.A. Cohen, for example, explores this and others, the type of explanation at the basis of this belief and this assertion about making progress from one epoch to the other is a functional explanation, which explains that productive forces have primacy in terms of what Cohen and the other analytical Marxists see as a correspondence relation between the forces of production and the relations of production. And since, as Cohen, following Marx, explains, the forces of production tend to develop over time, they eventually reach a level at which the relations of production, so states and governments and political rules and capitalism and so on, fetter the productive forces. And that's where the conflict begins. That's how it arises. In other words, since the story goes, capitalist political structures and economic structures, laws about property, all of this, at some point fails to develop the productive forces, the analytical Marxist argument for why there is then progress in history is that rational human beings will not tolerate, and they go back to rational choice theory, will not tolerate the fettering of this kind, and so we'll try to transform these relations of production by replacing them with new relations that are optimal for the development of the productive forces. Now, I gave you this because this is where I'm going to start basically developing the critique. One problem with this account, as articulated again by other analytical Marxist authors, so people like Eric Olin Wright and Andrew Levine, focus on the thesis that productive forces develop and transform relations of production in an optimal way because it's in the interest or in the rational interest of the classes that are connected to each system and to their development. So in the case of capitalism, it's in the interest of the working classes to overthrow capitalism, which has become a fetter on the productive forces connected to the development of a capitalist system. So the classes have a rational interest to overcome this. However, the problem they pose and the criticism that develops from this is that the notion of interest here is problematic. Why? Because to have an interest is not the same thing as to know your interest. So the workers might have an interest in overcoming capitalism, but they might not know that this is actually their interest. And even to know your interest is not the same as to have the capacity to act in conformity with the interest that you know, because there are feasibility constraints and obstacles, and it's not as though the classes that rebel will continue undisturbed by other classes. So there will be issues with that kind of understanding of interests that becomes action. And then further, even if there is known interest, and even if there is capacity, the cost of transformation may be really high. So the assumption that the orthodox, or as redeveloped by analytical Marxists about historical materialism make, which is that productive forces will always transform and develop to such an extent that it will eventually the fetter will emerge, and then that fetter will lead to the replacement of this society with this other society, say of capitalism with socialism. This assumption is actually too optimistic and overlooks the complexities and the constraints that there might be on these transformations. So it seems to me that at this point, you are stuck on a kind of argument that is slightly different from the orthodox Marxist argument, which is, well, it's enough to have working classes that will know their interests and that will act in accordance with their interests. Because what is the guarantee, says the moral socialist, now me, that socialism is feasible given the limitations of class struggle, given the obstacles to class capacity, so the fact that classes might not be organized, given the division of humans, not just in classes, but also in other groups, religious groups, cultural groups, people who think the problem is the foreigners, migrants, all kinds of different interpretations, which actually trump class solidarity of the kind that is needed to overcome societal divisions at this level. And also given the various empirical obstacles to this political discovery of this kind of shared humanity that stays at the end of this process. So I'm going to revisit the alternative account, so the Kantian, the moral socialist account on progress, to try and say how it might help us give a different story, a different motivational story for how there might be this transformation. And here, like the Marxist, orthodox Marxist historical materialist story, the moral socialist story also focuses on the issue of progress, not with reference to individuals, but with reference to progress from a more general standpoint, which is what we might call, as I said in a slightly old-fashioned way, the species being, which is what Marx talks when he talks about not just individuals here and now, but the human being more generally. So what is the species being? The species being is a way of talking about humanity that goes beyond the individuals alive at any particular point in time, and that tries to reflect more holistically on humanity as a temporally stretched moral relation. And we've talked already about the relational account of freedom and how that works. And if we distinguish between the two perspectives, so that of the individual on the one hand and that of the species on the other, you might understand how even events that seem difficult to understand from the standpoint of single agents can be seen to contribute to progress seen from this philosophical historical perspective. And I'm going to, in the rest of the talk, just unpack what this means to think about progress from this philosophical historical perspective. And in doing so, I'm going to help myself to some elements of Kant's thinking that I still think are plausible and valid for the present, where they are connected to his own answer to the question of progress as it appears in this essay published in 1798 called An Old Question Raised Again. Is the human species, he says human race, I'll call it the human species, is a species being constantly progressing? And this unfolds through a reflection on the question of progress in history, which is the following. Even if we acknowledge the force of moral norms, and we have to acknowledge that because of the categorical imperative and all the Kantian framework, is there any evidence that these moral norms have actually any purchase in an alienated world, or in the world in which we live, which we might call, following what we were discussing yesterday, an alienated world? So is there an occurrence, or an event, or a manifestation that can give us hope about the prospects of morality in this alienated world, the prospects of the categorical imperative? Now, the difficulty with asking this question is that we have to do with, as we said, with the actions of free human beings. And so the moral norm can tell us what to do, and on the account of freedom of agency that I was exploring yesterday, we actually know what the right thing to do is, because we have critical capacities and we have reason. But there is also something like freedom of choice and what we might call free willing, where we don't know, even if people know the right thing to do, whether they will actually follow through and they will then do it, whether they will act on these kind of alienated principles or on the right principle, let's say. And also, external circumstances will conspire against us, so there is something like ideology, as we described, there is false consciousness, and there is also just sheer brute force. So you might try and do something and then you get killed. So to ask whether moral actions have effects means, Kant thinks, to single out an experience which, as an event, points to the disposition and the capacity of human beings to follow undisturbed their moral imperatives, so unconstrained, to overcome the limitations of empirical nature. And again, to say that something is possible is not to say that it will occur, because we can't predict, as Kant says, from a given cause an effect with certainty. All we can say is, will there be circumstances prevailing that contribute to it, and what might be these favorable circumstances? And of course, these favorable circumstances, they might happen once, but they may not repeat themselves again. So is there anything that we can draw out of this experience of these favorable circumstances for our more general story about progress? And therefore, since we can't predict the outcome from the causes, all we can talk about is a sign, is manifestations, as in the way in which Kant talks about it. So you can't have a cause of moral progress, and you can't have a certainty about moral progress, but you can have events that you can look at and say, well, that's a sign that there is something like moral progress. Now, it's important that we don't talk about causes, but we talk about signs, because if progress were causal, it would be irreversible. And if progress were irreversible, we actually wouldn't have had the Holocaust after Kant's reflections on progress and the signs of progress and so on. And we actually wouldn't be on the brink of environmental catastrophe after my reflections on moral progress. So a sign is just a sign, it's not a cause. It's an empirically observable phenomenon of a moral disposition that tells us something about human beings more generally in specific empirical circumstances. And here, as I said, we're looking for evidence of progress not in the lives of individuals, but in the development of human beings as collective agents. And so, on Kant's theory, there are some events in history which are events that we can observe by privileging the moral standpoint. And from that set of normatively privileged relations, we can then say, well, maybe this event is an event that gives us a sign that there is something like moral progress, because it shows us that sometimes moral actions do have a practical import. So, someone at this point, again, the historical materialist or the orthodox Marxist might say, why do we even need a sign? Because on the traditional historical materialist analysis, the interests of the workers, which, as Marx believes in the end, are also the interests of humanity, are actually enough. So that is the sign, that workers have this interest, and that's what continues the story forward. And the Marxist will continue, the destructive force of capitalism, the destructive force of the environment, for example, or the kind of destructive energies that it kind of unleashes, is such that when the vast majority of people are pauperized or are exploited or are oppressed or just can't live under it, the push against capitalism will inevitably follow. Now, here I think the Marxist analysis goes too much in the direction of technological determinism. And in other words, it's kind of too quick to assume that in the way in which these conflicts unfold, which they might well unfold at some point, we will always privilege the socialist interpretation of what is causing the conflict as opposed to some other interpretation that some other political group will give us. And so that this tension between the forces of production and the relations of production will swipe away other cultural or religious factors. So someone might say the environment is caused by some other story that they'll come up with. And we know this because in the era of fake news, you get all kinds of explanations for all kinds of phenomena. So this is very familiar that there might well be these interpretations in the end prevail. And that might actually affect how the people who are oppressed think about the causes of their oppression. So again, I want to give you the example that I gave also yesterday, to think about the case of migration. On one diagnosis of it, it's a byproduct of a certain type of capitalist development. But on another one is the development of the tensions that come out of people moving from one part of the world to another part of the world are tensions generated by cultural conflicts. And these are two different interpretations of the same type of crisis that might be connected to the development of globalization, but for which you need a political interpretation. And so in the end, which of these interpretations mobilizes people is as much a question of our ability to shape politics as it is of the necessity of the argument that follows just from theoretical premises. So it's as much a question of just knowing the patterns or the tendencies that the historical materialist story describes, as it is a question of cultural and political hegemony of the kind that Gramsci talked about when he said it's not enough to just have these tendencies, you have to know what to do with them. So even if we accept the historical materialist story that the conflict between the forces and the relations of production is all that matters, and I have my doubts on that, there will still be a need to make a case for socialism on a level that gives another account of the desirability of the change in this direction rather than in the fascist direction or in a more regressive direction, for example. So we will actually need, as we said in the first lecture, an argument that addresses the skeptic, and the argument that can address the skeptic at that point is going to be a moral argument. It can't be an argument that is just based on the interests of the workers and the relation between the contradictions of capital. So then you have you park this historical materialist worry, and then you have another worry that's a moral socialist worry, so a Kantian worry, which is almost the opposite of it, because it says, well, at this point you've turned socialism into a kind of moral duty. So shouldn't morality then be self-sustaining? And why do we even need a sign that things go as they should? Why can't we just do the right thing and nothing happens? And why is, as Kant thought it is, and this is what I'm going to explore in a minute, Kant thought that the sign of moral progress was a revolution. In his case, was the French Revolution. So why is the revolution the sign? The historical existence and manifestation of revolutions is a sign of moral progress. And it's a very different, it's revolution like the way in which Marx describes revolution, but for a different reason from the one that Marx gives for revolution. So it's a moral revolution as opposed to a materially determined revolution. And here, Kant is departing from a tradition which starts with other considerations around what might explain progress in history, which traditionally focused on the actions of great men, for example. So you had in the French Enlightenment, in Voltaire's account of the century of Louis XIV, you had a model of the actions of the great men that kind of move history forward. Or I think when people talk these days about politicians with charisma and leaders and so on, I think they're also in that paradigm of thinking about politics as led by human beings, individuals, leaders. But you're also not focusing, as another tradition in the history of political thought focuses, which is the more Machiavellian tradition, on a civilization. So in Machiavelli, you have consideration on the greatness and decay of the Romans, or in Montesquieu, in Machiavelli, you have the discourses on Livy. In Montesquieu, you have the considerations on the greatness and decay of the Romans, and the Roman Republic and Empire often was used as a trope for people who wanted to talk about historical progress and decay, to think about models of developing republics. Kant focuses on something very different, which is not the people, so not the leaders, not the individuals, and not the civilizations, but actually something that was beginning to emerge in the 18th century, which is, and which we mentioned in the first lecture, which is the public sphere and its reaction to a revolution of the time. And he focuses on the reaction triggered by an event like the French Revolution, because he thinks that that affects the mode of thinking of those who observe the revolution, so the spectators. And he says they show this mode of thinking of enthusiasm for the French Revolution shows us that there is a kind of universal and also disinterested sympathy for the actions of these people who are acting in a completely different part of the world from one in which you happen to live, for causes that might be completely unrelated to the causes that you would rise yourself to fight for. And there is this kind of association that develops just out of a moral sympathy, basically. And he says, and I quote, "These show this universal yet disinterested sympathy for the players of one side against those on the other." So you have this view of conflict between different groups here, even at the risk, continues the quote, that this partiality could become very disadvantageous for them if discovered. So the cost of transformation is still high, but it's still happening. Now, it's interesting to see here that unlike the justification of the kind of revolutions in general and the justifications that connected to the protagonists in a way of great historical events, so Kant is not saying it's Robespierre or someone of Danton or whatever. He's focusing on the partiality of a public that would otherwise be impartial. This is the whole point of the disinterested sympathy. And that is what is being celebrated here, the fact that this mode of thinking, Kant says, consists, quote, in a wishful participation of the spectators that borders closely with enthusiasm, and the very expression of that enthusiasm is fraught with danger. So these people are challenging norms of conventional speech when they express enthusiasm for the French Revolution. They're going against the mainstream. They're identifying with something that is not very fashionable. It's not in their interest to do, and it puts them in an uncomfortable position. So that response is the kind of partiality of impartiality, shows us that human beings, Kant thinks, again, I think plausibly thinks, that human beings sometimes are motivated by feelings other than their self-interest or their self-preservation or their mere sheer survival, self-assertion. And that's because the disinterestedness of these spectators proves the moral character of humanity's predispositions. And so Kant identifies a sign of moral progress in enthusiasm, which is, again, he explains the attitude of those who favor with the cause of the whole of humanity when there is a conflict between these different groups, and they decide it's actually this group that represents the cause of humanity, not this other group. And who raise themselves above their immediate interest, even at the cost of sacrificing their lives. This, Kant says, this sign of moral progress is noticed not the event itself, but the dispositions that the event generates. And it's manifest in the feeling that it triggers by the disposition to act from duty regardless of what would be in your self-interest. And in some ways, regardless also of the alienation in which you might experience, which is a kind of sensible representation of moral ideas. This is the part where actually the Kantian story, the moral story, is not that far from the early Marx story of political emancipation, because the young Marx also finds in political emancipation a sign connected to the enthusiasm that is generated by a cause of one group of people who Marx says take it upon themselves to represent the whole of society. And, quote, What is the basis of a political revolution, asks Marx? It's that a section of civil society, so bound up with the conflicts of commercial society of capitalism, emancipates itself to achieve universal dominance. Yet, Marx insists, no agent, and so this speaks to this concern about how does the working class end up having a revolution. No agent can play this role unless it arouses in itself and in the masses a moment of enthusiasm in which it fraternizes and merges with society in general and is perceived and acknowledged as its general representative. So again, this is where Marx is explaining why is the working class, why does it have a role that is emancipatory not just for the workers but for the whole of humanity? Because it's the class capable of arousing this type of enthusiasm. Now, I'm going to say something about why exactly is the feeling of enthusiasm here, and then you get out all very enthusiastic by the lecture. Why does it contribute to providing this visible sign of humanity's progress in history? What is exactly the nature of the link between this event, the revolution, and as a kind of sign of moral progress, and then enthusiasm as the manifestation, empirical feeling that manifests that sign? And I think here it's actually useful maybe to explain a little bit what do I mean by revolution here? And so why does Kant select the term revolution, but also how we might think about revolutions in general? And a lot of people who think about revolution, they think about violent events. And they think about violence. So when you say revolution, the difference between revolution and reform is that one is peaceful and the other is violent. But actually, not every revolution needs to be violent. So if you think about peaceful revolutions like the Velvet Revolution of 1989, it was a revolution, but it was not a violent revolution. And they're not that common, but they exist. And the difference is that it's a mistake to think about reforms and revolutions as on the basis of the type of violence or not violence that is connected to each of them. Because actually, and I think here Rosa Luxemburg was right, reform and revolution are not different methods of historical progress that you can pick out from the counter of history, like you pick hot and cold sausages, saying, do I want revolution or do I want reform? She says, those who oppose the method of legal reform to the goal of replacing an existing political order, it's not because they are opposing one that is slow and one that is fast, or one that is calm and the other one that is more turbulent, to the same goal. The problem is that every revolution is the act of a political creation of a society, regardless of how it comes about. And legislation, so the types of reforms that that revolution initiates, is the political expression of that creation. So in this sense, every process, and therefore the key to a revolutionary change is actually not the way in which it comes about, it's what it does to the fundamental legal order, to the way in which we think about rights and property and connections like that. So every process of legal transformation of that kind has at its basis a revolution. And so in that sense, revolutions can be of all sorts. And the question of how that revolution comes about is contingent and historical, and you can't settle it in the abstract. And you can't either also not rule out that it's either violent or peaceful or whatever. Okay, so now let me go back to this question of why are revolutions a sign of moral progress? And here there's two arguments that can be made, and again, these are reconstructions from this discussion around the connection between revolutions and the philosophy of history. The first one is about the boundaries of political feasibility, and the second argument I want to make is about the cultural effects of political education. So let me start with the boundaries of feasibility. Why do revolutions shift the boundaries of feasibility? How many times, I'm sure this has happened to a lot of you here, how many times did you suggest a kind of radical proposal or a radical vision of society and you were kind of dismissed as some sort of idealist? This happened to me earlier on. That says, you know, that sounds really great in theory, but what we need in practice is we need to be concrete and we need to think concretely and we need to think about what's feasible and so on. And actually, when Keir Starmer, the incoming prime minister in the UK, was recently accused of breaking several campaign pledges and lying, he said, I have to be realistic about what is possible. So basically, I have to lie because it's a tough world out there. Now, what isn't possible is itself subject of political interpretation, because there are no hard facts in the world, and behind every fact, there is actually an interpretation of the fact, but also of the ordering of that fact compared to other facts, and of the assessment of the relative value of that fact, and a kind of ranking of facts. And so what our assessment of what is and isn't realistic depends on our background understanding epistemically of the feasibility constraints of that assessment. And it depends on how we balance our priorities, how we order and how we value facts, and how we think about the relation between facts and norms. And here, there's actually a lot of elements that contribute to a proposal just being dismissed as unrealistic and unfeasible, including people are being told that this is just crazy, what they're thinking, that they're just mad, or people are told you're just being ideologically motivated, as though there is a truth out there that it can actually be reached without these political interpretations, or people are afraid to speak out when they say, well, this is not feasible. They think that what is feasible is actually something that everyone acknowledges and we all agree when we say it. Or you can be manipulated by propaganda when you think about feasibility, or you can be informed by fake news. So you're told something in the past happened and just didn't happen, and someone lied to you and you continue to reproduce that. You name it. And all of that was as true in the time in which Kant lived as it is in ours. But Kant thought that this revolutionary enthusiasm that was triggered by this event actually showed us that sometimes people get it. They are capable of going beyond all that rubbish and rising above these interpretations that are offered to them. And even when that enthusiasm that they genuinely express comes with danger. So the enthusiasm is the visible sign of the fact that people sometimes identify with these ways, apparently outlandish ways of thinking, which shows us that in this kind of conscious project of creating political institutions, which the revolutionaries are engaged with, in the act of transforming the world that they're a part of, they show to others, you guys can actually really take back control here, and you can be in charge. And you have a process whereby human beings become agents of their own history. And that is the empirical sign that the Enlightenment, understood as this process of self-emergence from self-incurred immaturity in Kant's definition, is actually feasible as well as being thinkable. It can be done sometimes in practice, and people can reach the Enlightenment. Circumstances aren't as alienated, and authority isn't accepted as given. They can see through this ideology. And so then progress becomes not a question of abstract guarantees and abstract discussion, but of actually just seeing how it works politically. And change, and the kind of change that politically was thought to be impossible up to that point, actually is just taking place before their eyes, and changes again in the enthusiasm. Now, this is the Enlightenment teleology of history, which actually a lot of people dismiss when, when I present these things, say, oh, this is just teleological, as though teleological was in itself an insult. But actually, teleological understanding of this kind is actually the opposite of the deterministic view with which it's conflated in these kind of caricature critiques that dominate contemporary philosophy. Because what this shows was what this type of event, what this type of occurrence shows, that instead of reifying nature, this discourse on progress, it demystifies it. It turns into something that is completely still capable of being shaped by us. And so instead of reproducing a religious outlook on the world as something that people can't control, it dismantles it. And then progress depends not on what nature does for us, to help us in this sense in which we were talking earlier about what is hope. I need to see for something happening in the world, and that reassures me. But it's about what we do with transforming circumstances. And so we don't find the circumstances that are propitious, but we actually think about how they are being transformed. And in other words, revolutionary enthusiasm is the kind of moral feeling that we experience when we realize that nothing is as settled as it looks, and however much we think we are ideologically manipulated or controlled by alien forces or shaped by other people, companies, commercial, whatever, advertising, change does happen. And it's in these moments that human beings come to see themselves as in control and in agents of progress. And the other thing that is very important to say here, it's a sign and not a causal process, because sometimes a leap forward is followed by a leap backward. So this is also the fact that this happens. There are these progressive moments, and that there are these signs that we occasionally get from history, doesn't tell us anything about what follows from there. So it doesn't mean that then the institutions are progressive constantly, because it's constantly a struggle for kind of reasserting freedom. So it doesn't mean that there is then no continuity and no rupture and no setbacks. And in some ways, the point that the argument is making is that revolutionary achievement is built on the work done by generations in history, but not necessarily in a linear way. It can be a jump forward and several leaps backward, and I don't think it matters on this account. It doesn't have to be linear, and it doesn't have to be developmental and continuous and cumulative, because it's actually all that it needs is a sign. And just the sign must somehow manifest itself every now and then. So Kant thought that, in his case, the growth of trade and the interdependence between states was responsible for these conflicts that new commercial societies were involved in, and with colonialism, but also that these circumstances might also lead to an assertion of a project of cosmopolitan peace, as we talked in the first lecture. And of course, the way in which he lives is very different from the way in which we live. But actually, it is also in some ways very similar to the way in which we live, because it's a process whereby we have to understand that no faith can save us except for the faith in the human. But if we give up the faith in the human, then really nothing can save us. And we can't afford to lose that faith. And acting on that faith requires being able to think about how political institutions that preserve that faith can be maintained. So Kant thought that the French Revolution, why did he pick the French Revolution? He thought, well, this was valuable because it set in motion a process of realization of universal rights. Now, we now know that those rights were limited, that they were just rights of the bourgeois citizens and so on. But the point was that what it was showing to him was the fact that might doesn't always dominate politics, that sometimes there is a kind of ought that is asserted, and that's a moral ought that is asserted in political action. And it's only that ought we can see when political institutions that people begin to shape take the form of institutions that require an assertion of relations of right between people. And that's what was important about this process, in which the political and the realm of rights and justice becomes the vehicle through which we can settle our disagreements. Now, other people later challenged this diagnosis, so Marx then began to say, well, actually, this was not enough, because if you don't move beyond capitalism, these relations between states will always be hostage, as we explained yesterday, to the injustices of the global markets. Others then added that class is also too narrow a perspective, and you must think about gender and race. Others will now say, well, humanity itself is too narrow, and we need to think about our relationship to nature. And all of these are revolutions that some we have had and some we haven't had yet. But all of these are also what they show us, that in some ways, anti-colonial movement, none of this story is incompatible with anti-colonial movements, with feminist struggles, with anti-segregation, with anti-abolitionist campaigns that have conquered the sympathy of a wider public, so as to now actually make it impossible to say openly racist things. But again, that's also a boundary that shifts depending on politics. And yet the norms, to some extent, have changed, and that shift in social norms is something that's really important, and that the revolutions give us a sign of. It's exactly the proof that these norms are not unchangeable. So what they show, I think, so these are basically examples all of the Enlightenment as a political project, and examples that both show us that the real Enlightenment, the Enlightenment of the past, was limited, but also that we have much more to do in that same direction. And so these transformations can be feasible because the enthusiasm that they trigger and the sympathy is something that's important about, that tells us something important about the human. So not all men want to hang on to sexist norms, for example, and not all white people want to continue to be reproducing racist stereotypes. And I think what they show us is actually not that the Enlightenment project is flawed, but that it's unfinished. And so what French revolutionary action secures for Kant is the expansion of the boundaries of feasibility. And we can think about those terms, about revolutions of the past in those terms, as expanding the boundaries of political feasibility, even when they fail politically. So this, I think, helps answer this analytical Marxist puzzle of revolutionary action that I started with at the beginning, because it explains that material constraints aren't the only source of motivation, and how it depends on these constraints depends on discourse, on political argument, on cultural narratives that are the work of what Gramsci would have called intellectual hegemony. So what seems unacceptable at some point can be then justified from the inside, and that's because of the work of these revolutionaries that kind of challenge norms and conventions. So do revolutions always work, is the question. They don't. Are they nevertheless valuable when they are aligned with these moral imperatives? Kant seems to think that they are, and I think so too. Now, I want to say something, having talked about how revolutions moved the boundaries of political feasibility, I want to talk a little bit now about the politics of progress from the point of view of a kind of aesthetic role that Kant describes as revolutions playing. So why you can understand progress in revolution, as I said, in changes, in terms of changes of political norms and legal norms and so on. But there's a kind of second dimension of enthusiasm which has to do with the impact of revolutionary change on culture more broadly, and culture understood also as arts and literature and so on. So that's because that's connected with a discussion that Kant offers in the third critique of enthusiasm as the sign of a sublime state of mind. What is the sublime? The sublime is the idea of the good, the enthusiasm is the idea of the good which has an effect on human beings, and the feeling of the sublime that these observers experience when they feel the enthusiasm for the revolutionary events has this kind of extensive treatment in a part of the system where aesthetic issues are discussed and art and so on, because it explains the predisposition to the feeling for morality through the kind of aesthetic work that these kinds of events and the legacy that they leave does. And I'll just say something very briefly about this. It just represents the enthusiasm of the French Revolution at this aesthetic level, represents the power of moral ideas from a symbolic perspective. So, and Kant gives a lot of examples of events that have this kind of symbolic, artistic, cultural effect, aesthetic effect, and the examples that he gives on the French Revolution are similar. The feeling of enthusiasm affects the spectators and then is turned into cultural projects in which the legacy of that revolution is captured, even when the revolution itself is defeated in some way. So the sentiments that it arises of this kind of impartiality of the partial, somehow, the partial standpoint that endorses the impartial standpoint, initiates a process of moral education, even when the political education sometimes fails. And that's why in this account, the defense of failed revolution is just as important as the defense of successful revolutions, because if they're successful, they change the legal norms. But if they fail and they still leave a genuine feeling of enthusiasm, and people can learn from the defeat in this more aesthetic, specific way. And the nature of that process is not one that can be completed within the lifespan of single individuals. The effects of it are of a kind that remain, as I say, even when the events themselves somehow take a different course and the revolutionary efforts were to fail. And so the collective memory, in some ways, of these kinds of events is inherited by future generations. This is the aesthetic argument, and enables them to be part of this temporally stretched collective, the way in which I've explained the human species, through this collective process that is entrenched in artistic reflection or cultural reflection more broadly on these phenomena. And so it's, again, another example of a failed revolution is the way in which Marx talks about the Paris Commune of 1871, where he says the working people of Paris were celebrated as the harbinger of a new society, with the heroes that were defeated were enshrined in the heart of the working class. And that's because the historical experience of those revolutions informs the current struggles of political emancipation, and so shapes the way in which present generations think about these transformative events. So in these kinds of times of revolutionary crisis, when the old world is struggling and the new world is not being born yet, what people do, they return to this aesthetics of the revolution. They return to the past and to the assessment of the past through cultural products in this search for orientation about the future. And so you think about the ideas of revolutionaries as they leave their mark on these cultural projects. And so, you find them in literature, you can find them in arts, in cinema. And you learn not just from their triumph, as I said, but also from their failure. And you think about what they have achieved, but also what they leave out. And you can then learn in terms of thinking more coherently and more completely about future events. Now, you might ask, okay, why does this not apply to other types of collective events? So some people might say, what's so special about revolution? If the argument is more about the cultural legacy of these events, why not war, for example? So war has also a traumatic impact, and war also leaves a legacy on cultural products and traces in culture. And I think the difference here is in disposition, because wars make us give up on humanity, whereas with revolutions it's different. Humanity is being affirmed. And there is no enthusiasm for war. There is at most kind of celebration of heroism. But there is no refinement of moral disposition through this appreciation of shared humanity that the revolution triggers. So Kant and others, people after him, made a lot out of this argument about the relationship between the aesthetic and the ethical, which I can't go into too much detail now. Schiller was also a big champion of this idea. He thought that political transformations are not enough for full human transformation, since coercing people will never trigger the kinds of dispositions that are required for this fundamental change. And so what you need is something like a process of cultural aesthetic education, which returns us to this conception of philosophy as an ideal and a mode of thinking of which everyone is capable, and which requires ongoing practice to be perfected, and that filters into ongoing cultural practices to be perfected. So Kant tried to capture all this, and this is really where I'm going to wrap up very quickly. Kant captured all of that which can't be captured just by the transformations in the political in this mysterious sentence called the ethical commonwealth, the ethische Gemeinwesen, which is a kind of ideal, like an aesthetic ideal, or like an ideal of something, of a society that doesn't exist yet, but which we experience as relevant through our imagination, through our culture, through education. And that's in some ways this aesthetic ideal of the cultural commonwealth is like what is needed politically, but more of a kind of representation of the politics of the future, of the kind of utopia of the future. So just like the political state is needed to coordinate and to create these relations of freedom that are then entrenched through forms of right and law, the ethical state is triggered by the recognition of the fact that moral efforts, taken by single individuals, are not enough, and what you need is these practices of recognition through something higher, and also higher from the politics. So you need to have a mechanism that can fight domination and oppression and ideology, but that fights it in a way that is not coercive like the political state, and does it in a way that takes the form of this ethical community. So, and here is where the differences are between this project of revolution as I say, as a political project, and the project of revolution as an imaginary, sort of artistic, aesthetic project, almost. In a political community, revolutionaries use coercion to ensure compliance, and people who sympathize with the use of that coercion, with the fact that there is a kind of direct attempt to control the state somehow, or to control the ways through which forms of rights are changed. But in the ethical case, in the case of the ethical community, it would contradict the ends of the moral to compel people to feel ethically in a certain way. And so in a political community, you can force people to be part of a system of rights, since rights are needed to use external freedom. In the ethical state, there is a kind of different justificatory structure where one can't use force to ask people to be moral. The only approximation of it is the exhibition of the moral through the symbolic, and that's again the aesthetic experience. And then there is a kind of difference in scope. So the political state is restricted to where the political institutions, where power resides, need to be challenged. This ethical commonwealth, which is more of an aesthetic utopian ideal, has no boundaries and has no scope, and concerns the totality of human beings and concerns the entire human species. Now, this explains why, as I say, political emancipation is just the first step towards complete human emancipation. And complete human emancipation is not a process that is led just by individuals, but is actually who fight politically, but it's also a cultural and historical process where yes, the juridical is a precondition for the development of the moral community, but it can't be, the moral can't be reduced to just what relations of right and politics achieve. Now, I'm going to end with this because Marx also argues that freedom from domination can't actually be achieved just with political coercion, just with political means. Even though these means are indispensable, he also says there is something like a difference between political emancipation and human emancipation more broadly. And he says that while reforming laws and structures is essential to initiate human emancipation, what is needed to complete it is what he calls a revolution in disposition. So an inside revolution, not just an external revolution. And so political emancipation, as I say, he says, is limited because it liberates individuals through external means, but it's not sufficient to realize true moral freedom. Because human beings, to realize their full freedom, must be not just legally good, but also morally act spontaneously and not out of fear, for example, of being coerced by the law. And so Marx says that again, he follows Rousseau in this. He says that this political emancipation can't be enough because what we are after is a process of transformation of human nature and of its dispositions. And that is an internal revolution as opposed to the external revolution. So wrapping up, what kind of faith do we have to revolutionize our conditions, but also our dispositions? That's where the philosophical perspective on history is needed. And so you go back full circle. To motivate action in this long-term project, which is not just the kind of endeavor of one individual or one generation or one nation, but a prolonged historical effort, you need a kind of practical faith and that is grounded in moral duty and a reflection on history that can support an analysis of collective progress of this kind. So the right attitude to revolutions is either of the past or of the future is not the attitude that says, well, either reject or either accept them nostalgically or just reject them because they're too scary. The point is, on this account, to insist on the relevance of the experience of revolution for motivating collective hope, which is what I've called progress, including of failed revolutions, for the collective memory of people who participate in them, either politically or in this aesthetic way through access to culture. And to think about how revolutions are related to the experience of historical progress doesn't mean either to be stuck with the nostalgia for the revolutions of the past and to just kind of follow the scripts or think that we can follow the scripts of these revolutions of the past, nor to exalt the revolutionary potential of the future without thinking about revolutions in this much more extended way, not just as political acts, but also as something to do with dispositions. So what we do on this account, we look back to previous experiences and we find evidence of the power of moral ideas in the feelings of enthusiasm that are aroused by these transformative political events. And of course, we also find disillusionment and disappointment and the other feelings that sometimes this approach to these revolutions triggers, but it's a kind of disappointment that if you have a philosophical perspective on history, becomes a disappointment from which you can learn something. And so it becomes a productive disappointment rather than a kind of nihilistic disappointment. So I will just leave you with this idea of the revolutionary events, which play an educative function in addition to a politically emancipatory one, where the memory and the thinking about these events and reading about them and experiencing them in these different forms, the memory matters as much as the actual occurrence in the process of our political and moral education. And so we consider how these revolutions of the past have happened and the inspiration that they give us for the challenges of the present. And when we do that, we might be able to give an answer to this question of what can we hope, which is, in the end, the final answer to all three questions that I began with, both what can I know, what should I do, and then finally, what may I hope. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for this really wonderful finale, and I'm sure there will be many questions today. And as always, we have the Q&A, 2 mics at the aisles, and then afterwards we will thank everyone for everything that everyone has done. Okay, so I think we should start here.
Thank you so much for your lectures. I have a question I've been meaning to ask for the past 2 nights. Today, when you introduced your philosophical account of history, you talked about history being reconstructed from a moral standpoint. So I was wondering, would you say that the Marxist critique is a moral critique, or is there a normative root to it? Because you also mentioned the analytical Marxists today, and to my knowledge, they have a deep disagreement about it. So I was wondering where you stand on that issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, well, this is, as you know, a very, very big debate amongst Marxists, and so one has to jump one way or another. The disagreement isn't just on whether there is a moral critique, it's also on whether it's a critique based on justice, on the concept of justice, or something else. So the question is capitalism unjust, where unjust takes a specific form, or is it wrong from some other point of view? And then there is the further question, which is it might not even be, the question is irrelevant. That would be the more extreme answer. I think I'm on so for me it's easy to answer the question that says it's just not relevant. Morality isn't just not relevant. That's where I started by saying there is this tradition that says this is all a discussion, it's a waste of time for the reasons that I was trying to explain in the first lecture. So I think the moral critique of capitalism is very important. It's in Marx, it's controversial how important it is throughout his life. There is some evidence that in the beginning, in the early Marx, the moral critique is very important because there is this conception of the human species and the human being as an end-setting autonomous being whose autonomy is disrupted by this process of capitalist production. Then as he goes on, as the theory becomes more and more specific and you get more and more into the analysis of capital and capitalist structures, the question of morality somehow fades out, and it's not clear whether it fades out. This was a big discussion between the structuralists and the rest on whether it fades out because Marx doesn't think it's right or because he just thinks he's said his piece on morality. I have the view that the analysis is consistent throughout, and that in Capital and also in later writings, you find traces of this type of critique of capitalism. I am a little bit more ambiguous, and I don't really know what to think about the debate on whether it's actually a critique based on justice. But it seems to me that the discussion around political emancipation and human emancipation that you can reconstruct from the, for example, the Jewish question, some of the earlier Marx analysis, makes it a little bit hard to reduce the critique of capitalism just to a critique of justice. And then, of course, there's also discussions about, sometimes justice is the product of ideology. So it depends on what we mean by justice. If we mean positive justice, then Marx doesn't think that you can actually have a critique of capitalism that is reconstructed from the structural legal relations embedded in these systems, because the whole point is to actually normalize that unequal exchange between the capitalist and the worker. If we mean by justice something a bit more ideal, that's not just about the empirical description of the justice frameworks or the constitutions or the laws of different states, then it may be that there is a critique of justice, which I think then can be offered by going in the more direction of Kant's cosmopolitanism and thinking about these different structures of global justice, international justice, and the sort of domestic justice that connect to each other. And then it can be also a critique of justice. But as I'm a little bit reluctant to say that it's critique of capitalism based just on justice. I think it's a moral critique, but it has other aspects to it that are not reducible to just the injustice of these types of relations. That seems a bit transactional, and I think there is a little bit more to the story.
Thank you for these 3 evenings of wonderful arguments. Some of my questions remained not fully answered. The first one, I think the emphasis was the freedom of agency of the individual. What about the freedom of agency of social movements, which is the driving force of history? There was a sentence in one of the questions on the first evening, democracy is a byproduct of liberalism. While I think democracy is the byproduct of working class movement. It is the sum of all the acquired rights, through struggle acquired rights. And we see that whenever working class movement declines, democracy diminishes. And if we are to imagine our moral socialism, what are the social movements in socialism going to be, which stand in agonistic relationship to each other, so that they keep radical democracy also in socialism alive? Second question involves emotions, role of emotions. We see that moral arguments does not help against the emotional impact of far-right rhetoric. I was happy to hear the word enthusiasm today, bringing in the role of emotions in social transformation. Could you elaborate on ways of creating counter-emotional impact, counter-rhetoric which create emotional impact? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Both are really great questions. On the first one, I didn't mean to say it at any point over the 3 lectures that social movements don't matter, or that the moral socialism is just the responsibility of the individual. And I always actually talked about the moral agent, but that moral agency takes different forms. And I think the social movements that we reconstruct from these struggles, where we can see which struggle, with the help of moral argument, distinguish which of these struggles, which of these conflicts in society are progressive and which ones are regressive, I think of social movements as moral agents as well. And I think that collectives are as important in transformation as the beliefs of individuals. I think that they are connected, that there is a way in which the beliefs of individuals, not just as individuals, but actually as people in this, participants on discourse, and so participants in the public sphere, then help create or refine these social movements and engage with them. And so I completely agree with you that democracy is the fighting, and to the extent that we have democracy, it is because we have these struggles and we have the politics. This is where I was saying in the first lecture that I disagreed with the Kantians who think that you can have a categorical imperative and that helps you criticize capitalism and that's all there is. The argument that I've been trying to build towards is an argument that starts with the moral standpoint, but then tries to explain how the moral stance becomes embedded in different contexts and different sites of struggle, and so on. The other thing that I want to say, and where I want to go, this is now getting a little bit more complex also in my head, but where I want to go with moral socialism is actually exactly in a project for thinking about a future socialist society that isn't just limited to saying it's only the workers that matter, which has been the traditional analysis and which has been, I think, plausibly criticized by saying. That doesn't mean to say that the contradictions, the economic contradictions, the distributive issues aren't important, but I don't think that we have to decide between, gender struggles and race struggles and working class struggles. Now, you ask a really good question, which is, what is their intention with each other? What if they are, how do we decide? And again, I think that's the work of democracy, and it's the work of these social movements to negotiate their priorities, to be able to interact with each other, to be able to come to compromises or to fight with each other. But the point of the platform is that they wouldn't be able to do that unless they were all able to somehow bring the concerns of their shared humanity. And then, yes, there are specific decisions that need to be made about where do you give in, if you need to make these decisions about sacrificing some group over the other. I don't think there's something that theory can settle in the abstract or it can tell you. I think it's also contextual. Actually, it depends on country to country, and it depends on the politics of that country. The point of the platform, the point of the vision is to say that it needs to be a kind of intersectional socialism that can work through a critique of capitalism by encompassing as many of these struggles as possible, as opposed to ruling them out because they're not part of the main contradiction between the capitalists and the workers. So in that sense, I think it's in some ways a kind of vision of complete democracy, but it's not also a vision of complete democracy that can be achieved without some democracy in the practice of achieving that vision. I think the other aspect that I'm glad you raised the question about feelings, but that's also why I ended with aesthetics, because and this is what I wanted to say, that there is a kind of misperception of the moral view that says the moral view doesn't care about feelings and it's just about knowing what the right thing to do. And I think engaging with circumstances, including these circumstances of ideological manipulation and, as we discussed, false consciousness and so on, means engaging with the complexity of the human in these empirical circumstances, where the belief of the Enlightenment thinkers that I like was exactly that the aesthetic can help with that, with the program in that way. Why? Because, as Kant puts it in the Critique of Judgment, the aesthetic judgment has this capacity to share a universal somehow, and that's why works of art are so important, and literature is so important also to me, and why you can't have a conversation just at the philosophical level. And again, where it's not about isolating and saying there's feelings here and there's moral imperatives there, or saying that actually feelings have to take priority, it's more about thinking in a more balanced way about the relationship between these and the different forms of cultural production and experiences that we as humans produce that enable us to put these things together, including the enjoyment of science, for example, or enjoyment of kind of common art and so on.
Good evening, and thank you for these lectures, as they've given me much to think about, and I think I'm not the only one. I have a couple of pointers. I'm going to try to be as quick and concise as possible. So, if there is, I think there could be a place for Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts and the account of alienation that, like, he describes there. And then this is a mea culpa because I was not here for the first lecture. But if epistemically, in moral socialism, would be preferable either a deterministic or an indeterministic account of freedom, or perhaps a blend of the two. And then in conclusion, given the successful endeavor of these lectures, I'm going to read because maybe so I'll put like, how should or how can an intellectual that aims to be organic to the workers or the working class in Gramscian terms to be effective in such times for the public sphere and in the public sphere where there is such an overflow of information and data and so on and so forth. And in conclusion, using also a concept, mutuality from the thesis over the concept of philosophy of Benjamin, which constellation of meaning should like such intellectuals strive for and try to present? I guess like moral socialism would be like your first choice, but maybe there is some others. Thank you.
Yeah, great, thank you. Well, I mean, I start with the last. I guess I gave you my way of thinking about these things, and I'm sure, as I say, there's the tradition of the Enlightenment and the post-Enlightenment and the Marxist tradition is full of resources, and I don't think in these lectures I meant to say that only Kant matters and forget about Hegel and forget about the orthodox Marxists and forget about the analytical Marxists and so on. This is the type of thought and discourse that helps me make sense of circumstances and makes me give a kind of analysis of society. But I think different people will have different interpretations and different intuitions on where they find the resources to develop their own socialist politics or socialist instincts, or even just critique of capitalism to the extent that they have a gut feeling about what might be wrong with capitalism. The question that you raised, the second question, is connected in part to this one, and I think it's a really important one, because I think we have lost the political agents capable of actually channeling all our different commitments, including all our different interpretations and all our different views of the world. And this is something I was talking about earlier in this debate that I mentioned, where it seems to me that there was a role that the political party, as traditionally understood, which in many ways was an institution emerged from the liberal period, because it was all about bringing these groups of people and making them discuss with each other and come up with platforms and negotiate conflicts and have principled views of what should society do and how should it change. There is a sense in which that institution has been completely destroyed, not just by capital, by which I mean that has been captured by technocracy or by capital, by lobbying, by, we all know the story of the drill about contemporary political parties. Most of them are desperate for funding, and so that to run campaigns, they need to become slaves of some rich person or other and increasingly lose their democratic independence. And there's a straightforward materialist story to tell about that, but it seems to me there's an equally important ideological story, which is that people have just lost faith in the capacity of parties to operate as the types of institutions institutions that can bring together the concerns of social movements on the one hand, the concerns of lawmaking on the other, and the concerns of just thinking about future societies in the long term. And so some sense of we need to move within a democratic horizon. And therefore, intellectuals have no home, in a way, including the organic intellectuals that you were talking about, because there are no political groups out there that can help us articulate discourses, that can help us bring all these different perspectives together and have a more coherent narrative of what's going on in the world and how can different groups of people articulate these concerns and these commitments. And that, to me, is a loss. And if I were to say about, again, this is just my intuition, I don't see another place where we can start other than the importance of recovering political parties. And what's really important about political parties is that they are, in principle, disconnected from the nation state, or they can be, they're communities of principle, basically. They're like homes for people who are thinking about critiques of society. And this is something, I mean, I've written about in other work a lot more, but the short version is that it seems to me either you somehow have to recover this capacity of thinking about collective agents with one foot in the social movements and one foot in lawmaking and thinking about democratic future, and therefore recovering the party as an institution, or we are left either with just the kind of intellectual that goes around and gives talks and people listen to, but doesn't do anything because, you know, people are very happy to give you a platform if you don't matter, and usually intellectuals, unless they have power, unless they can connect to real political agents, they actually don't matter. We just talk to each other and we teach our students, but nobody really cares what we say. And sometimes it's very easy to just give us a seat on a table to pretend that we actually had a say. And so it's only if you are able to be integrated in a democratic life where you exercise public reason in this Kantian way alongside others, that there is really a chance of changing anything. And there, again, I don't think intellectuals are the only ones, because in every site, in every community, everyone who comes from their own life experiences, from their social roles, from the job they occupy, everyone will have their own sense of what needs to be done, or how to act, or how to connect with others. And what we are lacking is the capacity to integrate all these projects. They're just fragmented and people don't know of each other. And so you get this sense of hope and despair and doom that everyone feels completely paralyzed by. And I think, as I say, there's a kind of materialist story for that, but it seems to me there's also an ideological story that we can push back with discourse. And this is one small contribution in that direction. Economic and philosophical manuscripts, I think at the beginning, maybe yesterday, I can't remember if it was yesterday or the day before, when I was talking about alienation, I had very much in mind this idea of the person as being, you know, being detached from itself in certain material relations of production, as opposed to how that human being would feel at home in a different set of social relations. But again, the story there, I don't think is a deterministic story. It's exactly the opposite. It's a story about freedom and the imperative to realize this freedom in a world where forces that we think are beyond our control entrench unfreedom and make it really difficult for us. And it's the work of social critique to undermine and to unpack these challenges.
Hello, thank you very much for your lectures the last 3 days. I very much enjoyed them, though I'm not a political theorist and expert and lack much expert knowledge on Kant and Marx. So forgive me, I didn't fully understand the internal logic of your whole reasoning. Nonetheless, I am concerned a lot about the question how to organize democracies, though agents hold incommensurable ideals on democracies better. Okay. And so I'm a bit puzzled concerning the relationship between democracy and economy, how you posed it. According to you, there is no democracy without moral socialism, but if agents holding incommensurable ideals on democracy manage to cooperate in realizing the moral socialist project, why do we need democracy at all?
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Okay, I start with the second question because I didn't mean to say that democracy doesn't matter. In fact, and I also don't think that, in a way, socialism is a full democratic project because it there is this inherent anti-authoritarianism and anti-paternalistic streak into it, which I think pushes in the direction of a requirement for democracy. What I was saying is that under capitalism, we don't have the ideal of democracy, and often capitalist structures are presented, and indeed the capitalist states in which we live are presented as democratic states in which there is democracy. And what I wanted to say is that actually if we think about democracy in this more robust way of an ideal of freedom, that can't be the case if it's not globally expanded and if it's not globally realized. So what you have instead is democratic processes and democratic movements that make gains and lose those gains as they are able to contain or not capitalist forces. So there is a kind of, as I see it, a politics of, on the one hand, certain tendencies of capital accumulation and then related structural injustice, both global and domestic, that undermine democracy and democratic structures. That happens when the state is captured, when it's captured by lobbyists, when funding, for example, of political parties depends on advertising and commercial factors that shouldn't really matter to our ability to exchange opinions. And so there is a kind of parallel. It's not that, as I said earlier, either there is democracy or there isn't. There are democratic forces on the ground that are part of a politics that, to the extent that it tries to contain and tame these capitalist forces, is going in a democratic direction, and I think therefore also in a more or less socialist direction. And to the extent that it accommodates capitalism is actually at the same time undermining democracy and accommodating capitalism in the form of technocracy or liberal managerialism or whatever other ways in which people make decisions these days. Okay, how to organize democracy? This is the point at which I go back to the, I don't know if how many of you have seen the film The Life of Brian, where at some point he's going around and saying, "I'm not the Messiah, I'm not the Messiah." And his mom says, "He's not the Messiah, he's just a naughty boy." So I'm not the Messiah, I'm just a naughty girl. And what I'm saying is that I don't know how we organize democracy. All I'm saying is what processes we can push against and what kinds of parts we can all think about in our own activities and in our own lives and with our own political commitments, and what narrative we need that we can maybe all of us somehow agree on, and then the rest is the work of politics for which there is no Messiah, and I think it's a good idea that there is no Messiah, and there shouldn't be a Messiah. So even if I was the Messiah, I would not say that I am the Messiah.
Okay, so I think we start grouping questions, and please be brief.
Yes. Thank you so much. It's been an inspiring 3 evenings. You've been working through 3 of Kant's questions. There is, of course, a 4th. You mentioned it briefly on Wednesday. Maybe you could just shortly elaborate what, for you and in moral socialism, is der Mensch. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, are we grouping?
Yeah. I'm not sure who is next.
During your lecture, at some point, you mentioned that teleological thinking is different from deterministic thinking.
Yeah. Okay.
And I wanted to ask you,
yes,
what's the difference?
Yeah, thank you. Got it.
Thank you very much for the lectures. Today you talked about that not all the social movements are necessarily involve violence and so on, but in the case and in the actuality they mostly involve violence because of these structural determinations and so on, because these different classes support their interests. They cannot give up on their interests until this most radical point of volcanic explosion, as Rosa Luxemburg explains it. And as you described it yesterday with this Albanian businessman and so on. Mm-hmm. But then, in the case of these violent actions, as we see in, for example, French Revolution, we shift the focus to the spectator, and these movements are become educational or fostering for moral progress as long as we are not acting in these revolutions, because Kant also explicitly condemns the actions which take place in the revolutions. So so it's moral as long as like the revolution is in France and you sit and read it on newspaper in Germany. And like then I thought like then the participant of this violation and of this movement and the like agent of this violence is left with a really, I think, banal explanation, which is like the one that Hermann Cohen gave, like just you have this categorical imperative, like just be good, do good, like try to not do too much violence and so on. And I was like really curious, what's your take on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, with three? Yeah, this is also a really good question because it enables me to explain something about why I think Kant is right to say that we can't ask the question of is the revolution justified before it happens. And I think his entire argument about the revolutions and this perplexity that many scholars have about how can Kant be so in favor of the French Revolution and love the fact that it gives us this sign of these spectators that get enthusiastic by the actions of revolutionaries, which he's also in many ways, even at their worst and at their most violent, condoning and indeed applauding. How can that go hand in hand with the fact that he then gives us his argument about you can't actually have a revolution? You know, people asking. Okay, so I think this is a kind of interesting puzzle, but I think it's more of an interesting puzzle theoretically, because actually in practice, no revolutionary has ever asked a philosopher, should I please have a revolution or not? And so basically, it seems to me that Kant very sensibly says, look, a revolution, before it's happened, for all we know, could just be an idiot doing something that's a mess. And it's only as it unfolds and as it's happening that it triggers certain reactions and it sets certain processes in motion. But before the event, before the occurrence, and that's why he talks about the occurrence in the French Revolution, we can't really say anything about whether it's justifiable or not justifiable in general. And so it's not a kind of ethical question that makes a lot of sense, because for all we know, it could just be a bunch of people who have decided to set themselves apart from how a political community makes decisions and then just proceed to kind of disrupt that community. And we don't know, when we don't know what the cost of that is, how it might in the short term undermine an ideal that has been pursued for a very long term, just when it was about to be realized via reforms and so on. So it's not really a kind of abstract question that you can ask in these ethical terms. And I don't think any revolutionary, including Rosa Luxemburg, including Lenin, has ever posed the question in those terms. So in a way, from the point of view of the moral socialist, the moral question about the revolution of should it happen or should it not happen is not the question of is it permissible to do it or is it not permissible to do it. It's more what can we think and learn about thinking on revolutions in general, revolutions of the past and the imaginations of the revolutions of the future. But concretely, we're not going to be able to say a whole lot. I mean, there's a whole literature in contemporary political theory that talks about, you know, revolution and war, indeed, in those terms, where people are trying to kind of calculate when is this permissible, when it's not permissible. I'm not so convinced that these are particularly productive activities, and it seems to me that a lot of it is the work of politics, and a lot of the work of intellectuals should be to refine the tools through which we can think about these events, rather than to have an immediate answer to should it be done tomorrow or not. And I don't think, I mean, we can all have opinions, but I don't know that we can have much more to say from this moral perspective. But we do have a lot more to say about, as I say, the reflection and the role they play in history and philosophy of history that connected to it. A question about teleology and determinism. So I think of teleology as a way of thinking, and this is a very complicated topic, and you can stop me when I go on too long about it, because I've written a whole book on how to think about teleology in a non-deterministic way. But what it means to think teleologically, it means to think about the structure of our moral agency in the world, which is we pose an end, and then we try to realize that end. And to think teleologically is to think in conformity with ends. Now, these can be ends of nature, or ends of the human. A lot of the critique that says teleology is determinism conflates the human ends with nature and thinks that you can actually think about the ends of nature without thinking about the ends of the human. I don't think we can even reconstruct biological processes, organic processes in nature. Even the way, when we use teleological language, even in nature, what we're using is projecting assumptions from the way in which we talk about human ends, and then we're making sense of nature as though there is a kind of purposeful activity in nature. But it's not deterministic, because those who think that teleology and determinism are the same thing are thinking the exact opposite way. So they're thinking that there's something about the human that works like nature. Whereas I think when we analyze nature scientifically as well, we're thinking about nature as if it was a purposeful human. So this is why it's the exact opposite. Teleological thinking in history is all about how you try to realize freedom, and realizing freedom means actually departing from this deterministic outlook. What is the human? Well, I didn't give the answer because I think Kant says that what is the human is the sum of the answers to these three questions. And so, you know, when you say, what can I know, what should I do, and what may I hope? Well, once you have answered these questions, which I was joking in the first lecture when I said they will all be settled once and forever here. But this is one way of thinking about them, and there are a lot of other ways of thinking about them, but I don't think there's an answer to the question of what is the human that is separate from the way in which we put together the answers to these three questions.
So we have time for one more question, and then I'll let you know who is behind all of this here.
Hello, thank you. I missed out your first lecture. And so I don't know if you already answered it, but yesterday when you had the example with the oligarch, I was wondering, so it sounded like we are all puppets and we don't know what is behind it. It's like structural, so we can't fight against something, but we can fight for something together as a collective. So my question is, because my impression is that morality is actually dividing us instead of bringing us together, how moral socialism can help. So why is it morality?
Yeah, okay, great. Well, the answer was in the first lecture, I'm sorry to say. But it's on YouTube. There's some private company that will now be able to present it to the rest of the world. And so that's okay. What my argument, which was in that lecture, was about our epistemic capacities and the capacities for critique that humans have regardless of where they come from. And it's from those epistemic capacities that we then develop an account of reason as a process that helps us distinguish actually between instances of ideology and then other kinds of instances where we exercise critique in the way in which Kant describes through these three criteria of enlarged thinking, consistent thinking, and thinking in the place of everyone else. So if we think about morality as connected to the problem of doing, as connected to the problem of knowing, and of the problem of knowing as connected to how we think about reason, and those capacities that humans have just because of their shared reasoning processes, then it's not as divisive. It's only divisive if you think that there is no connection between the epistemology of reason and the practicality, the practical aspects of reason, that it seems to be a problem.
Yes. So thank you once more for these wonderful days, these wonderful lectures, and yeah, very impressive evenings that we had. And now I want the team to come on stage, and I'll let you all know who has been working in order to make this possible, and also whom we have to thank, and then we'll celebrate. Okay, so many, many thanks. This is the team of our Center for Social Critique. Very many thanks to Christian Schmidt, to Isette Schumacher, to Marvin Esther, who has taken all those wonderful photographs, Sveta Pauli, Svanas Stemmler, Friedemann Melcher, okay, and to Sirius. Samuel Schriewski, Hannes Kupfer, Josephine Bergholz, Ruben Heitzmann und Louis Leary. Und leider nicht anwesend, aber uns alle herzlich grüßen lässt mein Co-Direktor, der Co-Direktor unseres Centers, Robin Zelikatis. Der ist gerade noch in den USA und konnte es deshalb für diese Woche nicht einrichten. Ja, tausend Dank an euch alle. Das war wahnsinnig viel und wahnsinnig tolle Arbeit und ja, dass das dann alles hier passiert, ist natürlich vor allem Lea Ypi zu verdanken, die auch in einer, ich meine, das haben wir alle gemerkt, es braucht ja wirklich eine wahnsinnige Energie und Lea Ypi hat eine unfassbare Energie, um hier 3 Abende so zu füllen und so zu füllen, dass man immer das Gefühl hat, man will eigentlich jetzt immer noch mehr hören. Wir würden gerne aus dieser Kurzserie, die wir hier erlebt haben, eigentlich auch eine längere Serie und noch ein paar weitere Episoden hören, aber da alle Fragen eigentlich geklärt sind, brauchen wir das ja vielleicht auch gar nicht. Insofern können wir alle sehr beruhigt nach Hause gehen. Ich möchte dann auch noch danken dem HKW natürlich, also allen voran noch einmal Bonaventure Nidikung und Lale de Boer, die hier unsere Ansprechpartnerin war, Jan Trautmann, der in enger Abstimmung mit uns viele Dinge organisiert hat, und natürlich allen Technikerinnen und Mitarbeiterinnen des Hauses. Jeder, der auch schon an, naja, sagen wir, universitären Veranstaltungen beteiligt war, wird merken, wie viel komfortabler, besser, professioneller, schöner die Arbeit in einem solchen Haus ist. Das fängt eben einfach an bei besserer Technik, schönerem Licht etc. Das soll gar nichts gegen die Unis sagen, aber es ist einfach so, dass wir immer so wahnsinnig glücklich sind, wenn wir in diesem Haus sein dürfen, wenn wir hier auf der Terrasse stehen dürfen, wenn wir in diesen Räumen sein dürfen. Das ist eben eine ganz besondere Erfahrung für uns. Die Übersetzer, die ich schon mehrfach erwähnt habe und für die der Weg hier runter vermutlich zu weit ist, auch diese haben hier eine wirklich großartige und sicherlich wirklich nicht einfache Arbeit geleistet. Insofern einen besonderen Applaus für Felix Kurz und Max Henninger. Und auch zu erwähnen ist unser Techniker Jörg Schulze, der hier für die Videoaufnahme der ganzen Veranstaltung verantwortlich ist. Sie haben ihn ja immer hier vorne gesehen. Und das wird dafür sorgen, dass auch diejenigen, die das eine oder andere verpasst haben, in Kürze eine Videoaufzeichnung eben dieser Lectures sehen können. Wir werden die Stellen Sie können die sehen über unsere Website. Wir haben so eine Website, die heißt Critical Theory in Berlin. Das findet man relativ einfach. Sie können dort übrigens auch den Newsletter abonnieren. Dann werden Sie über alle diese Veranstaltungen regelmäßig informiert. Danken möchte ich auch, wie jedes Jahr, unseren Grafikerinnen Daniela Burger und Lena Rosbach. Daniela war nur am ersten Abend hier. Ich finde es immer wieder begeisternd, wie sie das schafft, so ein sehr kohärentes Design für diese und auch weitere Veranstaltungen von uns zu machen und bin immer wieder glücklich und froh, wenn ich diese Plakate dann in der Stadt sehe. Das ist immer so der Moment vor den Benjamin Lectures, wenn man anfängt, die Plakate zu sehen, dann weiß man, jetzt wird es wirklich wahr. Unsere Medienpartner Agora 42, Philosophiemagazin, der Surkamp Verlag, denen sei auch ganz, ganz herzlich gedankt. Das ist für uns sehr wichtig, solche Partnerschaften zu haben und hier auch die entsprechenden Kanäle zu haben. Also vielen, vielen, vielen Dank allen, die hier beteiligt waren. Vielen Dank auch allen, die hier so rege teilgenommen haben, wirklich sehr produktive Diskussionen geführt haben und, wie man ja immer wieder gemerkt hat, extrem intensiv zugehört haben. Also das ist ja auch überhaupt nicht selbstverständlich bei solchen Veranstaltungen. Wir hoffen also, den einen oder anderen von Ihnen nächstes Jahr wiederzusehen. Nächstes Jahr werden wir das Thema, wir bleiben irgendwie immer ja beim selben Thema oder wir umkreisen immer dasselbe Thema. Das nächste Jahr geht es um Racial Capitalism und wir haben dafür Tommy Shelby von der Harvard University eingeladen, der uns dann ebenso wie dieses Jahr 3 aufeinander vorträgende Vorträge halten wird. Und wer es gar nicht ausfällt und auch nächste Woche schon wieder in eine Diskussion und in Vorträge gehen möchte, der sei herzlich eingeladen, nächsten Mittwoch im Senatssaal der Humboldt-Universität. Dort wird vorgestellt das Buch von Jason Stanley, wie Faschismus funktioniert, also die Erscheinung der deutschen Übersetzung seines Bestsellers How Fascism Works, und das werden wir diskutieren mit einem Spezialisten für Rechtsextremismus und eben das Buch auf diese Art und Weise hier erstmalig vorstellen. Wenn Sie dann noch einen weiteren Tipp für das angebrochene Wochenende haben wollen, dann möchte ich Ihnen empfehlen, den Film Khartoum Offside, der ursprünglich, wenn ich richtig informiert bin, heute Abend sogar schon vorgeführt werden sollte, später auf dem Dach, aber jetzt auf Sonntag um 18 Uhr verschoben ist. Und auch da wird es dann ein Gespräch mit der Regisseurin geben. Ja, noch einmal tausend Dank an euch alle.
Rahel, can I also say thank you to you and to all the team and to the translators who have done an amazing job. I know how I'm not a slow speaker. And thank you to all of you for your questions and for making these such wonderful evenings. So let's have all a socialist applause, where the applause of one is the applause for everyone. Thank you.